Well, hello, Ransom Church. It's great to be with you this morning. My name is Paul, and I get to serve as the South Campus pastor, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Today, we're gonna continue on with the series that we've been in as a church for a little while now called Vital. This is the series called Vital, and we're actually getting into the home stretch of this series. We've been in this for a while, and a series this long, when you commit to something this long, it's got to be for a good reason. And as we've jumped into a new year, but also a new decade, we felt it's really, really important for us to understand what the heartbeat of this church is. And honestly, we felt like it was important to understand what the heartbeat of a life lived with Jesus is. And so last week, we started the discussion on our third and final core value, serving free of self. Pastor Phil kicked us off, and he walked us through this mind-blowing reality that Jesus came to this earth as a servant, and he calls us to a life of serving. And so today we're going to continue on exploring this core value and what it means to truly serve free of self. But before I fully dive in, I think it's worth taking a little bit of time to tell you some more about me. I'm not up here a ton, and so some of you honestly just have no clue who I am at all, and so figured I might as well share a little bit. I mentioned I'm the South Campus pastor. I've been around the Ransom for a few years now, but I grew up in Wyoming. And I grew up in an awesome family. I'm thankful for that. And in our family, church stuff was always a big, big part of my life. I'm thankful for my parents, for the family that I was born into, and we were always connected with a great church, and we were involved. And listen, when I say involved, I mean involved in church. Okay, so it's a small church, but let me put it this way. To my knowledge, the church we were growing up with, to my knowledge, there was maybe 6 copies of the master key to the building, and my family had 2 of them. So we were involved, okay? I was there, our whole family was there, some of us more willing than others, on Sunday morning, on Sunday evening, Wednesday night, sometimes Thursdays, pretty much any time the building was open. When I say I grew up in church, I mean it. In fact, true story, my very, very first memory, like the farthest back thing that I can recall in my life, happened in church. And I remember because it happened in the basement of this church building. I think we have a picture of the old church that my family went to. So we were in the basement of that building for the nursery, the kids program, and Miss Clara Lou Johnson was teaching the class that Sunday, and she was teaching us to spell the word Mississippi. I don't know exactly why, but she was teaching us to spell Mississippi, and I remember that because she was calling the S's crooked letters. So it was M-I, crooked letter, I. And I distinctly remember that because I was like 4, maybe 5, and I was thinking, this is weird. She knows those are S's, right? So I was looking at the other kids like, should we tell her? What's going on here? But that's just a distinct memory in my life. That's the furthest back thing I can remember, and it happened in church. So when I say I grew up in church, I mean it. Church stuff has always been part of my life, and when you grow up in a family like that, in a church like that, you absolutely get involved early with serving. Now, I'm sure I had other jobs before this, but the first real job that I actually remember doing at church was being in charge of the slides for music. Okay, now we have some awesome tech teams and projection volunteers at our campuses. In fact, if you're at one of our physical locations right now, I would love for you to turn around, look at the back of the room, and wave at our tech booth. Yep, that's our awesome tech team. They do an incredible job. They're all volunteers. They do amazing work. But let me tell you, and by the way, they're going to hate me for that, but let me tell you, those teams have it easy, okay? Because they get their fancy computers and their comfy chairs, and they're in the dark in the back of the room. When I was doing slides for music, I had to sit on a metal folding chair in the middle of the stage, right in the spotlight, with a stack of projection slides. People remember overhead projectors? I'm old enough to remember overhead projectors, all right? And that was my job. And switching the slides wasn't some little click of the button, guys. We're talking about Indiana Jones switching out the one for the next one. And it'd usually be, you'd see the shadow of the fingers every time, and you'd probably put it on upside down or backwards or maybe both. And if you were eating something, you probably left a giant fingerprint on the screen, and your dad would give you a look. And Whole big thing. Not that I know from experience or anything. But that was my first job, serving in church. That's the first job I remember. And eventually we did get a laptop and PowerPoint and all that. But by then, I had graduated back to the soundboard. We have a picture of me back in the soundboard. I was in the sound booth. That's right. That's me on the right, and my friend Ryan. And so I had moved on to the soundboard, which pretty much meant I watched my brother or Ryan do the job while I sat there. But those were some of my main church jobs growing up. That was the way I served. But I also played on the worship team occasionally, bass guitar, acoustic guitar. I was on the snow removal team. I helped with every VBS we ever had, maintenance, cleaning, you name it. I was probably involved with it to some degree. I served like nobody's business. We were involved in church. In fact, this is a terrible joke. Forgive me in advance, but I would tell people that I had a drug problem growing up because I was drugged to church every time it was open. I told you it was bad. But all the way through middle school, elementary school, middle school, high school, even into college, in the midst of devoting hours and hours of my life to serving within the church, not one of my friends came closer to Jesus because of what I was doing. Even in the midst of all that time, not one person looked to me as an example of who Jesus is. Even with all the hours of serving and giving and committing, I did not gain an ounce of spiritual influence with the people in my life who did not know Jesus. Now, maybe you have somewhat of a similar story. Maybe church has been part of your life, it's been part of your story, and you always did the things that you were supposed to do, and yet the people around you don't necessarily look more like Jesus because of what you've been doing. Or maybe that's not part of your story. Maybe church is more of a recent thing in your life, and you've recently started to get committed and get involved in serving, but you aren't really seeing the impact on the friends and family the way that you may be expected. Or maybe you're not serving at all, and you're just wondering, why would serving even matter? Why in the world would it even matter if I serve or not? I'll be honest with you. Serving does not guarantee spiritual influence. In your life, in your world, serving does not necessarily by itself guarantee spiritual influence. I'd actually like you to turn with me at this point to 1 Thessalonians. We're going to be in 1 Thessalonians for the most part today. If you raise your hand, our awesome ushers are going to come around. They would love to hand you a Bible. If you don't own a Bible, please keep this one. We'd love for you to have it. If you're using one of our Bibles here, we're going to be on page 714. 714 is where we're going to be in our Bibles here. We're going to be in 1 Thessalonians. Now, 1 Thessalonians is towards the end of the New Testament, and it's a pretty short book because it's actually a letter. It's a letter that Paul and some of his friends wrote to this church that he had helped plant in the city of Thessalonica. Now, these letters that would be written, they would be sent to the church, and then somebody would stand up and read the letter to the entire church body. So it's truly a letter to the entire church. Now, I want you to understand the church, this Thessalonian church, is by no means perfect, okay? In fact, as we read through this short letter, it's very quick read, but as you read through it, you're going to see that Paul is needing to address some significant things that this church is struggling with. He talks about things like disrespect and laziness and selfishness. He even has to devote an entire section of this letter to denouncing sexual sin that is taking place within this church body. So this church is not some spotless, shining thing that doesn't have any problems. And Paul also devotes some time in this letter to hammering out some theological and doctrinal things that clearly the Thessalonian church is either weak on or just flat out wrong about. So they're not the smartest, most well-read, knowledgeable Christians around either. They struggle with sinful habits. They're not necessarily the smartest, but I want you to look with me in chapter 1, verse 7, and see what Paul says about this group of believers. He says, "You have become an example to all the believers in Greece, throughout both Macedonia and Achaia. And now the word of the Lord is ringing out from you to people everywhere, even beyond Macedonia and Achaia. For wherever we go, we find people telling us about your faith in God. We don't need to tell them about it, for they keep talking about the wonderful welcome you gave us and how you turned away from idols to serve the living and true God. And they speak of how you're looking forward to the coming of God's Son from heaven, Jesus, whom God raised from the dead. He is the one who's rescued us from the terrors of the coming judgment. Now that's not bad, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I would be more than happy for my Christian performance review to sound something like that. I mean, shining example to all believers, that's a pretty good description there. So how in the world do we reconcile lazy, disrespectful, not knowing the theological answers and struggling with sexual sin, and shining example to all believers in Greece? Because I want you to notice, he's not talking about a journey from here to here. Both of these things are present at the same time. So raise your hand if you don't know everything about the Bible. Yeah, me too. Raise your hand if you still struggle with some sin in your life. Yeah, me too. All of us. But it's clear that Paul is communicating to them, and I believe he's communicating to us, that you can struggle and still represent Jesus. Let me put it this way. You don't have to be the perfect Christian to be a great example of Christ. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have your act perfectly together to point other people to Jesus. But we still need to answer the question, what fits in the gap between hot mess that this Thessalonian church is and shining example that they've also become? We're actually going to back up a couple verses to where I think we can find the answer. And we're going to spend the rest of our time exploring what that looks like for us. So read with me 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. Paul's writing about this church, and he says, "We always thank God for all of you and pray for you constantly. And as we pray to our God and Father about you, we think of your faithful work, your loving deeds, and the enduring hope that you have because of our Lord Jesus Christ." So Paul is writing to this church, and he's telling how thankful he is for them. And he specifically points out three things about them that fill the gap between the hot mess that they absolutely still are and the shining example that they have also become. And the first is faithful work. Faithful work. Paul says, when I think about you guys, I thank God for you, and I'm thanking him for your faithful work. And many translations actually put it as your work of faith, or work that comes from faith. Maybe the clearest visual representation is work that is born out of faith. Now, this word, the Greek word used for work here is the word ergon. And I want you to notice, it is not like some hidden nuanced meaning. The word work means work. Like active, productive effort. It's work. There's no hidden thing here. Paul is praising them for their work. And in our culture, in our context, in our setting right now, a good mental picture of this is serving, what we think of as serving. And I don't just mean serving in a local church, although that's a big part of it, but I mean serving in your neighborhood, serving with your schools, in your community, at home, just in your daily life, doing physical, tangible things for the people around you. Now, many of us are from religious backgrounds that make this work idea, that makes serving mandatory. In fact, maybe explicitly or maybe just implied, they would say that if you don't do X, Y, Z, if you don't do these works, you're probably not going to heaven. You're not even saved if you don't do these works. Some of us come from religious backgrounds that would be on the opposite end of that spectrum. And these groups only talk about getting saved, but then you might as well just check out until you die, because all that matters is heaven and there's nothing in between, so why even mess with works? And maybe it might even be a little risky. Now, some of us are from no religious background at all, and so we catch pieces of both of these messages, plus what the world might say about serving and doing good works, and it just gets to be so confusing. And because it's so confusing, some of us avoid serving altogether, because what's the point? And some of us end up devoting hours and hours to serving with works that are dead, with works that are useless or ineffective. Works like mine when I was growing up that didn't point other people to Jesus. Why do some works seem to flourish while others seem anemic? Why do some things that we do seem ineffective and some seem so effective? How can you even start to approach serving free of self when it all seems so confusing? Let me summarize it with this thought. It doesn't matter what the work is, It matters why you do it. It matters why you do it. And I think this is something that we kind of know inherently, but we need to be reminded of. Throughout this letter, Paul is pretty clearly sending the message to this church, to this group of believers, that the things they're doing, they're great, but it doesn't actually matter what they are. It matters why they're doing them. It's the why that matters. And in our case, we believe that the why must equal faith. It's the faithful work. Hebrews 11 tells us that faith is confidence in what we can't see. Ultimately, faith comes down to a confident belief and understanding in our relationship with God. That's what serving free of self is truly all about. It's working, it's giving, it's loving those around us because of our understanding that we are sinners, God is holy, and Jesus bridged that gap for us. So if the why behind your serving is some sort of legalistic obligation, or fear, or selfish motivation, it doesn't matter what you're doing, it won't have God's blessing. You're not going to experience the relational influence and the personal growth from God's blessing because the why is all wrong. But on the flip side of that conversation, no matter what, if your why is right, your serving can set captives free. If your why is right, your serving can be part of setting captives free. And some of us are lucky enough to have seen this principle in action. We've seen a simple home-cooked meal lead to a conversation about Jesus. We've seen a small, seemingly insignificant gift lead to a powerful spirit of generosity. We've seen an offer to help somebody move lead to an invitation to church. We've seen a simple note cause someone to weep and open up about their life. And if you've experienced those things, if you have not experienced those things, let me tell you plainly, it doesn't matter what they are. God can use the smallest things to make the biggest impacts in the lives around you if they're born in the right place, if the why is right. You see, Paul isn't thankful for the work that they were doing. He was thankful for the place that their servanthood was born. He was thankful for their work of faith. But that's not all he was thankful for, because he goes on to say, I'm thankful for your faithful work, and I'm thankful for your loving deeds. Number 2 is loving deeds. Have you heard the phrase labor of love? That comes directly from this verse right here. The old King James version of this verse translates that phrase as labor of love. Paul is thankful for their faithful work and for their labor of love. Now, confession time here. I have some bad habits in my life, even when it comes to things like spiritual disciplines. One of the main ones that I struggle with is just reading too fast. I'll just read too fast. I'll speed read through a few chapters, and then 20 minutes later, I'm wondering what I even read. And so for me, my first pass through this verse, I thought faithful work, loving deeds. Probably close enough, rinse and repeat, right? But when you look a little bit closer, I mean, what's the actual difference? I think the difference is not only significant, it can be life-changing. Let me explain what I mean. Works of faith are the everyday, day-to-day things that we do to serve free of self. It is absolutely getting involved with the serving team at your local church. It's going as a community group to do some service projects. It's getting involved with Love Sioux Falls. It's shoveling your neighbor's sidewalk. It's serving free of self as a daily way of life. But labor of love is a little bit different. It's almost like the next level of serving, because labor of love is following God's call on your life and giving it every inch of your heart. Labor of love is not only serving free of self, it's committing everything you are to something that's driven by a supernatural passion. It's not just a lifestyle of faith-driven service, it's a hard, painful labor driven by love. Listen to what Grant Richardson writes about this particular phrase in his commentary. He says, "We confuse cultural love with true biblical love. Agape love is willing to sacrifice for others. It's others-oriented. To love sacrificially is to labor until it hurts. The word labor means labor to the point of exhaustion. It's a love of blood, sweat, and tears. Self-sacrificial love moves us to labor. This love is willing to toil and to pay a price. Love activates arduous labor. Love prompts this tough grind. So let me ask you, when you serve, when you look at the world around you, when you give back, where are you willing to grind? Where are you willing to grind? I actually believe that serving in general, the day-to-day serving, should not be a grind. Now, I'm not saying it should be easy. I'm not saying it should be comfortable. But serving in general should not be a grind. But God has uniquely gifted you with skills, with experiences, with abilities, but more importantly, with a passion to impact the world in a powerful way, in a unique way. So where do you serve and give and love to the point of exhaustion? Where do you pour out every inch of yourself in a specific area because of the passion that God has given you? And some of you know the answer to that question because you're already there. Families who have adopted or fostered or have been involved with safe families or wraparound care, you probably know because that's your area. You pour everything into that. Maybe for you, it's your Ransom Church serving team, and you pour into it even when it gets tough. Even when you don't want to be there, even when leadership changes or structures change and it's a little bit frustrating, but you stick with it because it's your passion area. Or maybe it's a community organization in town that you've discovered, or maybe it's a global partner like Casas per Cristo or Poetas International, but where are you willing to pour your blood, sweat, and tears into serving free of self? Here's why that's such an important question. Your individual labor of love is a void in the world that God created you to fill. There is a void in this world that God created you to fill. So are you filling that void? In Matthew 9, Jesus says the harvest is great, but the workers are few. Are you filling that void that God created you to fill? Now, that's not a question to shame you. That's a question to light your fire. Those who already know their labor of love will tell you that it is a grind, but it is so worth it. They'll tell you at moments it can be brutal, but they would not trade it for anything. In fact, they would say it's become vital to who they are. It's become vital to how they follow Jesus, to how they live out serving free of self. And let me say that this labor of love is not a replacement for work of faith. It's not some either-or thing. It's a both-and thing. Your life needs to include serving free of self as a daily lifestyle. Your life needs to be part of serving in your local church and in your community and with other organizations and individuals, but your life also needs to run wild with the labor of love that God created you to impact. Serving free of self is building a lifestyle of service and filling that void that God created you to fill. And the most beautiful thing about it is that you don't have to have your life perfectly together to chase that passion that God has given you. And when you do start to fill that void, no matter what your life looks like, it allows you to start to be an example of Jesus to the people around you. When you are chasing that passion, when you are filling that void, it allows you to continue to grow in your faith and be a shining example to the people around you. Which actually leads to the final aspect. Paul is thankful for the Thessalonian church's faithful works, their loving deeds, and their enduring hope. Their enduring hope. Now, I said I grew up in Wyoming. I think one of the best things in my life that has taught me what it means to truly have enduring hope has been my move from Wyoming into Minnesota Vikings territory. Because let me tell you, Vikings fans are a great example of hope and dedication for no apparent reason. I'm just saying, to an outsider, the Vikings fans, the passion and commitment that they show through year after year of futility and heartbreak just does not make sense to the rest of us. That's a cheap shot, I know, but it's real. But here's the deal. Following Jesus and actually living out a lifestyle commitment to serve free of self is something that to the rest of the world does not make sense. It does not make sense to the rest of the world for you to invest into relationships, to invest into friendships that aren't bringing any benefit to you. To the rest of the world, it does not make sense to make a regular tithe part of your family's budget. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to the rest of the world to actually come to church more than once a month. It doesn't make sense to the rest of the world to actually come for one service and stay for another gathering to serve. To attend one, serve one doesn't make sense to the rest of the world. It doesn't make sense to give up your Wednesday nights to serve with Ransom teens or to raise thousands of dollars so that you can go across the country or across the ocean to do hard work in Zambia or Juarez. These things don't make sense to the rest of the world because they're not understood through the hope that we have through Jesus Christ. And honestly, some of that might not make sense to you right now still. The truth is, a genuine and dynamic and growing understanding of who Jesus is and what he has done for us can drive us to do things that don't even make sense to ourselves. That kind of hope can carry us through circumstances that we would not expect to survive. That kind of hope can give us energy that we would not otherwise have. It can make us, take us places that we wouldn't otherwise go. It would motivate decisions that we wouldn't make on our own. It's the kind of hope that can bridge the gap between the hot mess that we absolutely are and the shining example that we can also be. I came across this phrase from a partner church, but I think it fully captures the heart of what we're trying to say here this morning. If you have a relationship with Jesus, you were rescued to be a rescuer. You were rescued to be a rescuer. This church in Nevada that we have developed a relationship with came up with this phrase, but I believe it captures the heart of the matter. And it's so fitting because Paul told the Thessalonians in that verse we first looked at that Jesus rescued them. And he rescues us from judgment, from sin, from death. We were rescued. Jesus came and died and rose again to rescue you and to set you free. Not to set you free to sit back and relax. Not to set you free to coast into eternity. Jesus came and died and rose again to set you free to be exactly who he made you to be. And that is a rescuer. That's a partner with him in his life-saving, world-changing mission to go and make disciples of all nations. Paul's writing to another church in Colossians 1. He says this, "For God wanted his people to know that the riches and glory of Christ are for you Gentiles too. And this is the secret. Christ lives in you. This gives you assurance of sharing his glory. So we tell others about Christ, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all the wisdom God has given us. We want to present them to God, perfect in their relationship to Christ. That's why I work and struggle so hard, depending on Christ's mighty power that works within me." That's why I work and struggle. You see, serving free of self is such a special core value to us here at the Ransom Church because it's both a response to the relationship we have with Jesus and an opportunity to call others to the faith and love and hope that can only be found in Jesus. Serving free of self is vital to our mission as the church, and it's vital to fulfilling our purpose as followers of Jesus. So before we turn it over to the campuses, let's have some honesty time. Where do you lack right now? When you look at these three areas, where do you lack right now? Can you honestly say that you are living out a lifestyle of serving? That your faithful work is strong and evident to the people around you? Are you committed to your church, to your community? Do your actions show it? What about your labor of love, those loving deeds? Can you say that you found that void that God created you to fill? And if you found it, can you say that you're fulfilling it to the best of your ability? What about enduring hope? Is your individual relationship with Jesus, is your understanding of Jesus and the cross, is your personal relationship with him leading to an active hope that perseveres, that persists, that endures, and that drives you to do things that don't make sense to the world, maybe don't even make sense to you? Because here's the deal. Your life might still be a mess right now. Probably is. I'm right there with you. You might not know all the answers. You might not know everything about the Bible or about all the theological things. You might still struggle with sin, maybe a lot. But you can still be an example of Jesus to the people in your life. You can still have spiritual influence. You can still point them towards Jesus. Serving free of self can be that vital piece that allows you to show Christ to the people around you. You were rescued to be a rescuer. So go be a rescuer. Now, South Campus, this is the opportunity that I get to speak specifically to you. And I want to speak to you specifically today because I don't know West Campus the way I know you guys. I don't know downtown or Rock Rapids the way I know you guys. I don't know online campus the way I know South Campus. And when I think about this group, when I think about this church, this body of believers, I believe with everything that I am that this group can be an example to all believers. This church can be a shining example to all believers. But it's going to require something of us, all of us. It's going to require us to self-reflect and to maybe take some steps. Some of us, when we think about that enduring hope, we have to admit that our personal relationship with Jesus might be a little stale. And that might require some steps from us. Might require us to actually carve out time to pray and read our Bible daily. Might require us to actually sign up for a community group or to actually speak up and get involved with discipleship. We might need to grow in that area. Maybe you need to really start to fill that void that God created you to fill. A few months ago, we had Orphan Sunday, and I had dozens of amazing conversations with people that were inspired by this idea that they could make a difference in the world. Have you taken those steps? Have you explored the different options? Maybe you need to recommit to your serving team and go a little deeper. Maybe you need to get involved with a marriage ministry or get involved with a nursing home ministry. I don't know what that void God created you to fill is, but I want to help. Maybe you need to talk to somebody about what it could be. But my specific challenge for this group today is related to serving. Not because we need more people serving. That's not it at all. We have amazing teams that do an amazing job. You can feel that when you come into this place. But my challenge is related to serving because if some stranger on the street says, "Hey, what's your church?" If you say the Ransom Church, you need to be serving. You need to be serving. Because this place is not some place for you to come and consume and go. This is the church gathered. This needs you. This needs your service to be what it can fully be. And if we come together and we serve and we model this, I truly believe that we can be an example to all believers. I believe that we could change the world. And so if you need to get involved with serving because you just haven't taken that step yet, maybe you need to grab your handout, write the word serve in it. Maybe you need to find somebody with a lanyard after our time in here and you need to tell them you want more information on serving. Maybe you need to jump on the Ransom Church app and let us know in there. But my challenge is to get engaged with this because I believe in the potential of this group of men, women, and children. And to signify that, I'm actually going to ask that you stand before we close in song. I'm going to ask that you stand together because I want to do something a little bit different. This is kind of This is what you would call a prophetic prayer. But I kind of reworded some of the passage that Paul used for the Thessalonian church because I think it can apply to this group as well. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. I'm going to ask you to hold your hands out in front of you. This might be uncomfortable, but I'm going to ask you to receive what I'm saying because I believe it with everything that I am. Our staff believes it with everything that we are. And I think if we receive this and pursue it together, we can change the world. South Campus, you have become an example to all the believers in Sioux Falls, Harrisburg, T, Lenox, Canton, and on and on. And now, the word of the Lord is ringing out from you to people everywhere, even beyond South Dakota, even beyond the Midwest. For wherever we go, we find people telling us about your faith in God. We don't need to tell them about it, for they keep talking about the way that you love, the way that you turned away from what the world said was important to serve the living and true God. And they speak of how you're looking forward to the return of our risen Savior because he rescued us. And now we get to be rescuers too.